talking about, there we go, texts and translations. So this is, of all the topics we have in this series, in a lot of ways I thought this was the most fun. In part because unless you are already in a place of error, it's hard to have this conversation in a way that's not edifying or positive, right? So unless you're a King James only, which is not a good position, then really it's kind of edifying. It helps us read our Bibles more. So this is one with a lot less controversy than others, although if you have a hot take, please, this is where you bring it. So it's okay if we get that as well. So let's go ahead and get started. So usually it says the Bible in the topic, but because we're talking about the Bible now, it's the Bible in the Bible. So I just wanted to list some key verses if you wanted to write them down. We usually do this. This is going to be otherwise devoid of the light category, only because this really firmly falls into what I think Rob and I both call like a fourth tier category. This isn't even a third tier one that we're supposed to unify over but disagree on. This is even below that, where it's just really about preferential choice. So instead, I just want to give some texts that we use as Christians inside the Protestant church to remind ourselves of the Bible's value and its trustworthiness. So these first two verses, and I tried to do Old Testament, New Testament for each one of them. These first two verses are promises from God to his people that his Bible, his word, will never fall away from the earth, right? That his word will be preserved, that it will be kept pure and holy, that it will always be present. And that's a great encouragement to us, particularly an encouragement to people maybe living during the Reformation, maybe people doing Bible translation in countries like Iraq and Iran and all of the native languages, like up in Tajikistan and places like that. God will preserve his word. He has kept it pure. That's what the first two verses about. The next two verses, Timothy and Psalm 19, both commend Christians to believe the Bible as sufficient for everything we need in faith and life. The law of the Lord is perfect, and the psalmist goes on to explain it. It enlightens the eyes, it teaches us, it forms us. 2 Timothy 3:16, probably the most well-known verse on the Bible about the Bible, right? The scriptures are breathed out by God and are sufficient for all manner of things. And then both John and Proverbs are commendations towards that what we read in the Bible is true. John chapter 10 is where Jesus says, "The sheep hear my voice, and they know that it's me." And so that's why when we read our Bible, we know that it's the authentic voice of God. It is his true words. That's what Proverbs says. The words of God are true. So this is both a promise that the Bible will never leave us, that it's totally sufficient, and that it is actually the voice of God speaking to his people. Those are all the baseline. Every Bible translation we're going to talk about, I think, fall into this category. Yes, you can so terribly mangle the Bible that it no longer becomes true or useful. But today we're just going to focus on Bible translations that generally fall into the category of reliable, that are okay to use, and these are the verses that help us understand what we're reading. When we open any of these Bible translations, we are reading the eternal Word of God that is sufficient for all faith and life and is his true and powerful words to us. All right, so what we're going to talk about next is the sources of modern Bible translations. And this is where a lot of the meat and potatoes of the debate goes. So if you're a vegetarian, everyone eats potatoes. It's like the fruit of life. So if you're anti-potato, anti-meat, then this might get a little technical, but I think it's helpful. So when we have a Bible in our hands, ESV, NASB, NIV, whatever you have, it's obviously the Old and New Testament. But we know that the Bible is not written in English. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew. The New Testament is written in Koine Greek. There are other kinds of Greek: classical Greek, Doric Greek, modern Greek. The New Testament is written in Koine Greek. So when we say that the Bible is perfect without error, we mean in what we call its original autograph. And the autograph is very literal there. It's someone writing, right? So in the original writing, the original version of it is completely perfect. Now we believe, because of those passages we read, right, in Matthew and Isaiah, that even though right now we do not possess those original manuscripts that Paul wrote on, that Moses wrote on, we do believe, because God has promised it to us, that he's preserved the truth of the scriptures. So they are perfect in the original autograph, the original source in the Hebrew and Greek, and then God has preserved the truth of those passages, of those books, throughout time. So the Bible that we have is sufficient, like Timothy says, for training, correction, reproof, and righteousness, and all of those things. So if it's in Hebrew and Greek, then what sources do we use? Well, every Bible you'll read now, it uses for the Old Testament something called the Masoretic text. The Masoretic texts, and the version of this you can find or buy online, is in German, so I always butcher it, but it's called the Biblica Hebraica Stuttgartenitze, right? And it's from Stuttgart. It's a Hebrew Bible that was compiled in Stuttgart. But it's a collection of sources compiled by rabbis in the early Middle Ages. And that's when we have the earliest versions of the Masoretic text. Now, we say that, and we think, wow, that's way later. But I think there's two things going on here. Because we do actually have older copies, specifically the Dead Sea Scrolls, which go back before Christ. Now, that's incredibly encouraging, right? We'll get into this in a minute. But the historical evidence for the reliability of both the Old and New Testament dwarfs the historical reliability of every other book, right? Both in how close it is to its authorship and in how many copies we have, right? We know that the more a book gets used, the more it gets destroyed, right? That's that Spurgeon quote, a man whose Bible is falling apart, his life usually isn't. Well, the more something is used, the more it's going to fall apart. The more something is used, the more it's going to be copied by scribes, the more versions of it you're going to have, right? And so for an example, the entire Roman conquest of France and England, we only have one source for that. And that's a book called The Gallic Wars, and it's written by Julius Caesar. And if you want to guess how many copies of the Gallic Wars do we have written in Latin that are from within 300 years of when the Gallic Wars happened, we have one. Just one. Which means that if the Old Testament, New Testament sources are unreliable, then there was just definitely never a guy named Julius Caesar, right? That's the gap we're talking about here. So the Masoretic text, that it's recent, doesn't mean it's less accurate, because again, we have many thousands of copies of it, and because Jewish scholars had an immaculate scribal tradition, right? You know, we remember that Jewish scribes refused to even write down the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, the name of God, right? And so they came up with a collection of Hebrew letters. They basically smashed the words Adonai and Yahweh together to avoid having to write down God's name. They had so much reverence for it. And that's actually where we get the name Jehovah, is from shoving those two things together. Anyway, all this to say is the Masoretic text is like impeccable scribal tradition that has, and from its own sources, it's pulling from thousands of sources on its own, a reliable picture of the Old Testament. Now we do have the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's a famous story I won't get into tonight, where they found it. The Dead Sea Scrolls do differ from the Masoretic texts in places. That's not to say that either one of them are unreliable. It's just to say that the Qumran community and the history of scribes and things they have there, over time, are necessarily going to differ from scribal traditions in other parts of the Jewish world. So those differences are totally expected with long-standing scribal tradition, with it changing in various places. They don't represent any serious change in doctrine. So Bible translations now will all use the Masoretic text, which you can buy a copy of online in the Hebrew. If you go to seminary, they make you buy it. But they use the Dead Sea Scrolls to cross-reference. They also use something called the Septuagint. The Septuagint is a Greek version of the Old Testament, compiled by Jewish scholars. The Septuagint is clearly referenced in the New Testament, right? This is something New Testament authors had access to. They were reading the Old Testament in Greek. The Septuagint itself precedes the time of Christ by a couple hundred years, so it's another very ancient document that we can help use to understand what should be in the texts. Now, because the Septuagint itself is a translation from Hebrew into Greek, it's going to have all those things that go along with translation. We're going to get into those, but it's still very, very helpful. Scholars still study it. It's helpful when we're getting the Old Testament texts. That is basically not controversial at all, right? All Protestant Christians, Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, I mean, this is what we use. The debate comes when we get into the New Testament text sources. And although we think, well, if this is like a history thing, then this is not going to be controversial. And I say to that, wrong. even defining terms here gets difficult because of what different scholars in different places think constitutes the majority text or the received text. So I'm going to touch on it from service level. It's going to be church history in 5 minutes. Did you listen to that podcast? It's an excellent podcast. This is my attempt to do church history in 5 minutes. So, the first major new copy of the Bible that was created in church history is called the Vulgate. It was translated by a man named Jerome in the 4th century AD. Jerome was around the same time as people like Ambrose and Augustine, same general time area, and he had access to thousands of copies of Greek New Testaments and Old Testament scribal traditions. And so he translated the Bible into Latin. We call it the Vulgate now. Do you want to know why? Yes? Right. So vulgar means common, which is not how we use it in modern America at all anymore. But it traditionally meant common, right? And so Latin was at that time the common language. Greek was the beautiful language of poets. Well, of course, when the New Testament was written, it was the language of common people. Koine Greek is a common person language. It's funny how time changes things. So Jerome is translating the Bible for the same reason we do. He wants it in the language of the time and people in which he lives. So he translates it. It's this really important moment in church history, Western history. I can't get into it more than that. I'm just going to say he makes a ton of mistakes. But I haven't translated the whole Bible in any language, so I'm not trying to sit in judgment. That Vulgate becomes the only Bible for 1,000 years. This is the standard because that's how the Roman Catholic Church does things. We have this, you all read it now, or else we kill you and your whole family, right? Because they would continually suppress the translation. Funnily enough, they would suppress the translation of the Bible into vulgar languages because they didn't want it in the common language. They thought it would confuse people. So over time, the Catholic Church continues to find and compile original sources. They continue to find copies of the New Testament, copies of the Old Testament. They find them in libraries. They find them in caves. They're continually adding to this just majestic Vatican library of sources over time. And it goes on and on over time. When the Reformation happens, it's happening around the same time as what we call the Enlightenment, right? Kind of this explosion of learning and academia and scholasticism. And a prominent figure in all of this is a Dutch scholar named Desiderius Erasmus, who you probably know as Luther's most hated foe from Bondage of the Will. But Erasmus is incontrovertibly a genius scholar. Genius at languages, he's very, very brilliant. And so what he's going to do is he's going to compile all of these New Testament sources, all these Greek copies, right? A piece of the Gospel of John on papyrus, a codex, a book of the New Testament found in Alexandria. And he's going to compile them, and he's going to publish a new Greek New Testament, the Novum Testamentum. It's a New Testament. And this has like shockwave effects in Europe, right? This is like Brad and Angelina getting divorced multiplied by Charles and Diana. Like, it's a huge deal. And I'm sorry, that's what we get excited about in this culture. That's the only kind of touchstone I can compare it to. Like, everyone hears about it. It's a huge deal. Erasmus becomes a massive celebrity across Europe, right? Parties are thrown for him. People throw money at him because he takes all of these sources that the Roman Catholic Church has been compiling ever since Jerome, thousands and thousands of Greek New Testament, Hebrew Old Testament. He compiles his Bible. So the traditional source of the Bible was what's called Codex Alexandrinus. You can imagine where that comes from. It comes from Alexandria, right? That's a great center of learning. That's going to be a lot of what Jerome used to translate his Bible, and that's some new sources that are found over time. Around the time, like about 100 years before the Reformation, as Roman Catholic scholars were going through, seriously, their stuff is just like miles deep, the kind of resources they have. And they compile a new set of sources for the New Testament that Erasmus draws from heavily. So that's called the Codex Vaticanus, because it's from the Vatican. And what comes from those codexes, those collection of New Testament writings, papyrus, and books, are referred to first as the received text, the text that we received from God. It's one of these really clever titles. Like, this is the one from God. What is your text from? So we receive this text. It's mostly made up of all the medieval sources, the Codex Alexandrinus. And so because it comes in the time of the Reformation Latin, you'll still hear it referred to as the Textus Receptus, or the TR. Erasmus's version forms what's called the majority text. So it differs a little bit from the Textus Receptus. There are changes. There are new things that are included because of the presence of all of the documents found in the Vatican. That's called the majority text. Now, these things are very common, but they do differ. And so if you care very much about the Textus Receptus, you're going to make a big point that it's different than the majority text. If you're a majority text guy, you're going to say they're mostly the same. These are the documents that are used to write the King James Bible, right? So primarily, William Tyndale translates a version of the Bible right before the Reformation. He gets killed for it. But 75% of Tyndale's translation ends up word for word in the authorized version, the King James Bible. And he's drawing heavily from, like, the Codex Alexandrinus. Erasmus uses the Codex Vaticanus, and so the King James takes mostly from Tyndale, even though they killed him, and then it's like, thanks for the work, but you got to die, but we're going to take all your work, and then we're going to include some new stuff. What happens over the next 500 years is that the church continues to do what it was doing before the Reformation, is it continues to compile sources. It continues to find things in libraries and in caves and in personal possessions and in buried, crumbled houses. And I think that's a good thing. The church continually looks. It just does the same thing the church was doing before the King James. It just keeps doing that work. It keeps adding to its library and its stores. And in particular, there's a really huge store of really, really ancient texts, including some from the 2nd century, right? Within a generation, within a lifetime of the apostles, we have like P54 versions of the Gospel of John preserved. Amazing stuff, which we find largely in Sinai, right, in libraries down there. And then we found versions of it that are in Rome that they couldn't find. It travels around. It has a whole story. It's kind of fun. So that becomes included, specifically around the turn of the last century, 1900. Now that we're aware we have even more resources, the Codex Sinaiticus is going to be added into the other texts to get something called the critical text. The critical text is what every other Bible you read is based on, right? It's almost entirely just the King James and the New King James that rely on the Textus Receptus or the majority text. Every other Bible you're going to see at Barnes & Noble is going to be based on the critical text. So, why do I bring this up? This might be, hey, this is kind of dry. Well, people like to argue about this. So one, I would like to equip you to either argue about it or to avoid the argument. Whatever you want to do with this information is up to you. Proponents of the Textus Receptus have 2 arguments to make, or 3 arguments to make, 2 good arguments, 1 bad argument. The 2 good arguments are thus as follows. The overwhelming security that we have in the New Testament text is God's promise to preserve it. That's true. Although we absolutely avail ourselves of common grace wisdom and things like higher criticism to better understand which sources are accurate, which ones aren't, ultimately our confidence is in the Bible's self-declaration of authority, right? God promised to preserve his word, and he did it. And so the Bible that was present for 1,500 years of church history is the Bible. Now, critical text people like myself don't disagree with that. Their other argument is that it plays a prominent role in the Reformation, which it does, right? The majority text is the thing that Calvin read from, and what Luther read from, and Thomas Cranmer and John Knox. Like, it forms the basis of the Reformation's language. And then we're going to get into a minute with the King James. That's really powerful. That has a lot of benefit to it, right? It's a part of our tradition, and it still is the Bible, right? The received text, the majority texts don't say things like, by the way, there's a 4th member of the Trinity. Not at all. So the majority text is the Bible. We can trust in its reliance because God preserved it. And also, by the way, it has a lot of heritage in our own denomination, right? That's what the Westminster Divines would be reading from when they're writing the Westminster Catechism. Now, I think the argument that goes off a bit the rails is the slippery slope fallacy, because it is a fallacy. Sometimes you can prove slippery slopes. This led to this, led to this. That's totally legitimate as a syllogism. But simply saying that trying something new leads to liberalism or compromise is a fallacy, right? It's an unproven assertion. And so what comes across sometimes is that the use of modern sources and higher criticism, which is used a lot of times to attack the authority of the Bible, because you're using shared language, because you're using modern things, this is going to lead to compromise, right? Sometimes even it's casting doubt on the sources, right? I've heard, well, you know who found all those copies? It was the Catholics, and we can't trust the Catholics. The problem with that is if we can't trust the Catholics, then the Texas Receptus, we still have a problem, don't we? Now, that's not the main argument. That's just a bad argument. Overwhelmingly, it's just based on the preservation, God's divine preservation of the texts, and its role in the Reformation. The biggest differences between the majority text, received text, and the critical texts are going to be in two prominent passages in the New Testament. One is going to be the story of the woman caught in adultery, which has one of the more famous quotes from the entire Bible. Let he who is without sin throw the first stone. That is present in all of the sources, like the Codex Alexandrinus, the Codex Vaticanus. It's there, that's why it's in the Bible. Same is true of the long ending of Mark, which we're coming up on rapidly. And the thing that maybe makes the long ending of Mark unique is it has the passage about they shall handle snakes and not be poisoned, not be hurt. When we found the Codex Sinaiticus in older sources from the 2nd century, they overwhelmingly didn't have those passages in them. So if you're following the critical text and that kind of theory of textual criticism, what you're probably going to see is these texts were not in the original autograph. We don't see them until about 100 years after the first versions. They're probably additions by well-meaning scribes who heard these stories. Perhaps they were passed around by maybe even the apostles. Maybe they had a good source, and they add them in there. The good thing about those passages and other textual variants is they don't really, again, they don't make any big changes to doctrine. And both the long ending of Mark accords pretty closely to the gospel, the post-resurrection narratives in Luke and Matthew. And the story of Jesus with the woman caught in adultery sounds like Jesus, doesn't it? This is how he acts. This is his heart. It's certainly not saying anything new about him. It's only affirming things we already believe about him. So that depends on your version of the Bible. If you open those passages, you might see a little thing where it says, earliest manuscripts do not include this passage, right? That means you're dealing with the critical text. And it's just letting you know, hey, the publisher's saying this is probably not part of the Bible. Now you might ask a question. If that's not part of the Bible, why do they still put it in there? Does anyone have the answer? It's kind of a gross answer. Yes. Which I heard from an executive at Crossway. If we cut these out of the Bible, people are going to be like, why did you cut the Bible out? And you're going to get protested, and it's a whole deal. So the truth is most critical text scholars, which at this moment is, it doesn't make it right, but it's the majority of Reformed scholars right now, would tell you that's not part of the Bible. So if you were even to go to, I would think, maybe a majority, it doesn't really matter. You went to a lot of Reformed churches, PCA, URC, OPC, the pastor will probably even skip preaching through these verses. So this was a test at my licensure. One of the questions I was asked was, would you preach the long ending on Mark? And I'm going to answer that later. So that's where this comes out. There are two passages of the Bible, and there's a different history of how we get our Bible. At the end of the day, what's important to stress is there is overwhelming agreement. Overwhelming agreement. Every major doctrine, every major moment in church history is completely and totally unified. The vast majority of scribal differences are things like prepositional phrases, right, or different word choices for similar words. Yes? Not universally, just a lot of people. A lot of Reformed scholars at this moment would say that the long ending of Mark and the story of the woman caught in adultery were not in the original autograph, right? So Mark did not write that passage down. It was added 200 years later by scribes. That would be probably the most common position. Well, so I would say let's import the two arguments I just made for the majority text, right? The two arguments they made were, one, God's going to preserve his word. God promised us that he would keep his word holy and pure. And that was in the Bible for a very long time, right? So God preserved these passages, right? According to one kind of critical theory, they shouldn't be there, but according to our critical theory, our understanding of these passages that say God will keep his word pure and perfect, Well, this was in the Bible for a very long time, thousands of years, right? Therefore, that's part of the testimony we should receive. God kept this in the Bible on a purpose. The other argument that they're going to make, right, is that it is in a lot of sources, right? It's not like the first time we see this is when William Tyndale made it up. There are a ton of sources, 380, 480, that do have it, right? So it's totally possible that the early sources we found, which are largely fragmented, they're like pieces of papyrus, they're pieces of a book because they're very old, we simply just missed the ones that have it. So that's going to be the majority text opinion, right? God's preserved his word, we can trust these things that have been here, and number two, there is still a lot of evidence for them. Yes?
So I don't think that a lot of this is like Western, sort of Middle Eastern focus.
Yes.
Like there's a Coptic church,
Right.
there's a Syrian church,
Right.
there is Orthodox church.
Right.
How does they fit into textual?
That's a great question. And each of those are different, and I can't speak to all of them. My understanding is the Eastern tradition is Textus Receptus, is that they prefer the ancient text, in part because they're the ones that kept it, right? Now that being said, the Syrian church was part of the ones that preserved the Codex Sinaiticus, same with the Coptic church. So I don't know that I can give you a big answer, but my cursory understanding of the Eastern Orthodox tradition is that they fall in an older majority text tradition, right? They don't really like the critical text, right? Whereas Roman Catholics tend to be in the critical text tradition, right? They've done a lot of the scholarship. It's a good question. So, moving on. I know that was big, that was kind of dense stuff, but it's good to know where this stuff is coming from, right? Why does it say that in my Bible? I want you to know that. I want you to know where the translations come from. So one more introductory clause. All right, translation targets. This is so important. If you have one takeaway, this is what I want it to be. Translation is interpretation. It is impossible to translate anything from one language and another without the aid of interpreting what you think it means, right? It can be, it's definitely, it's an etymological fallacy. You just say this word is this word, the exact same. That's not how it works in basically any human language that's ever existed. So anytime you translate even something from Spanish into English in modern day America, you are making choices about what English word you think best reflects the Spanish word. And so when we read a translation, we remain confident that it is the word of God because he has promised to preserve it and use it to rule and govern and shepherd his people. At the same time, we are aware that it is human beings using their interpretation, which includes, by the way, their theology, to guide them on what to say in each passage, right? So that means, and really good scholars will try to be as accurate as they can, but we as human beings aren't perfect in that regard. So translation is interpretation. There are two really great examples of this. And these are both maybe the most controversial things that'll happen today. So I had all that brainy stuff, now we're going to get to controversy and fighting. I want to talk about why the message isn't as bad as you think it is. Okay, right? It's controversial. Yeah, there we go. Torches, singing. Have you heard the people sing, marching on Philadelphia? All right. So the message was not written as a Bible translation. It simply wasn't. It's a project undertaken by an evangelical pastor who's now died named Eugene Peterson. When you talk about if translation is interpretation, Eugene Peterson is an interesting human being. He had a lot of interesting beliefs. I'll leave you to do that research on your own. But he undertook a project for himself to translate from Genesis to Revelation in his own understanding, in his own tongue. Right? His idea was if I was speaking to someone as I got this revelation from God, how would I say it in 1980 English? It is a paraphrase then, right? This is not a word-for-word translation. This is not a thought-for-thought translation. He's not trying to translate the Bible. He's trying to paraphrase it in the language. So when it's individually written, he's pretty clear. This is not a Bible translation. Please don't use it as a Bible translation. Of course, that's not how human beings work. We immediately all started using it as a Bible translation. It became an extremely popular one. So let me say this. As a Bible translation, please don't use the message. It's not accurate. For your personal devotion, as something to spur your thoughts, something to make you think, it can be useful. So I want to make that example by quoting two Message translations, and you can see how translation is interpretation. So these are both verses we're going to use in a little bit to examine the verses. Here is Isaiah, chapter 6, that vision that Isaiah has of God, which we all know pretty well, right? Woe is me, I am undone. Here is the Message translation. Doom. It's doomsday. I am as good as dead. Every word I have ever spoken is tainted and it is blasphemous. All the people I know live and talk the same way, using words that corrupt and desecrate us. And now I am looking God in the face, the King, the God of angel armies. It's pretty good. And I actually think it is kind of moving in our language, right? It's sometimes the power of the prose, specifically how much we're relying on the King James, can kind of obscure the emotion of what Isaiah is feeling. Right? And he does a good job there. But now, I want to go to a different verse, which is Romans chapter 9 in the Message. And sorry, I had to pull it up on my phone. I don't own a copy of the Message. So Romans chapter 9, verse 14 has this famous interaction that Paul has with his listeners. Is God unjust for electing some to damnation and some to salvation, right? And his answer is, who are you to judge the living God? And obviously I'm speaking from a Reformed Presbyterian perspective, but Romans 9 is this famous ode to predestination, to the sovereignty of God in election, to choose to hate Esau and love Jacob before they ever lived, right? And it's this testament to God's sovereignty and power. Here is it in the Message. Is this grounds then for complaining that God is unfair? Not so fast, please. God told Moses, I'm in charge of mercy. I'm in charge of compassion. Compassion doesn't originate in our bleeding hearts or moral sweat, but in God's mercy. The same point was made when God said to Pharaoh, I picked you to be a bit player in my drama. All we're saying is that God has the first word. No. That does not, I think, accurately summarize, specifically with the condemnation of Pharaoh, right? That God hardened Pharaoh's heart and destined him for reprobation. I don't think this is accurate, right? So that's why we say translation is interpretation. Eugene Peterson disagrees with the doctrine of election. He disagrees with the doctrine of predestination. So when he is paraphrasing Romans 9, guess what? That's going to come out. So that's just really something we really want to know. Another really famous example of this is Genesis 3:16. That's the passage where we talk about the curse, right? Adam and Eve have disobeyed God. They're kicked out of the garden. Adam's curse is that he's going to have to toil and labor and sweat now for that one which was free and easy, and ultimately he's going to die. And the curse to Eve is that there's going to be pain in childbirth. And then it goes on to pronounce one of the most difficult to translate passages in Hebrew, right? Because Hebrew 1 doesn't have a past tense perspective. That makes things really hard. Future tense, all these things are different in Hebrew. But furthermore, it doesn't have future tense, sorry. But furthermore, the directional nature of Hebrew is really hard. It's really hard to tell who is speaking to who in Hebrew. So another example of this would be Moses and Zipporah, right? When it says, well, I won't get into what it says. You can read it in your Bible. I'm not embarrassed of it, but it says, you are a bloody husband to me. But the word for husband is a cognate in Hebrew with the word son. And it's very unclear in that passage if Zipporah is talking to Moses or to their son. You just can't tell immediately from the Hebrew. So she may not be saying, you're a bloody husband. She could be saying, you're a bloody son to me, which could make more sense given that her son's the one that just got circumcised. So in Genesis, it says that the wife's desire will be for her husband. And that's not immediately clear what that means, right? One very possible, very strong translation that possessive language in Hebrew could mean that you want to be him. Your desire is to be your husband, to take his place. That's a totally viable translation, but it's not what it literally says. And unfortunately, there are 3 or 4 other translations that are equally viable. So some Bible translations will quote Genesis 3:16 as saying, her desire is for her husband. It'll just kind of translate it woodenly and say it's up for you to figure out. Other Bible translations will make a choice. They will interpret the passage. Well, we think this means, from context, from study, that her desire is to rule over her husband, and so you'll see translations like the ESV that say that. So in 3:16 in ESV, her desire is to rule over her husband. So that's interpretation and translation, right? So just for you to be aware, these things happen. They don't undermine the authority of our Bible, but it's good to know them. Who? Oh, the message? Should we pull it up? I'm actually super curious too, so I'll keep talking as I pull it up. I should have thought of that verse. So there's two goals when we're translating the Bible. One is for accuracy. That makes sense, right? We want to preserve the Word of God directly. But the other is readability. If you translate word for word without any concern about how English grammar is different than Hebrew grammar, about how even word order is vastly different in those languages than it is in English as a way to make emphasis. You probably know this if you know Spanish. Their word order is different, right? If you were to translate literally word for word with no accommodation for grammar or word order, the Bible would be completely unreadable. It would be mumbled nonsense. We can't do that. So we have to translate while being as accurate to the words, but also being usable or readable. And so word for word, accurate translation, we call it word for word. We're just picking the word, finding the English thing, and then maybe we're just adapting the grammar of it to fit the sentence. Thought for thought is, the point of this passage is this, and I'm going to use the same English words that correspond to that same meaning as it did in the Hebrew. Every single translation is somewhere on a spectrum between those ideas. No one is perfectly word for word. No one is perfectly thought for thought. In the Reformed tradition, we're going to lead more word for word than thought for thought, but we have to have a concern for readability. So those are the major targets when we're translating a Bible. So Genesis 3:16 says, he told the woman, I'll multiply your pains in childbirth. You'll give birth to your babies in pain. You'll want to please your husband, but he'll lord it over you. That's his interpretation. So, without making a pass on Genesis 3:13, let's go to each. We're going to do each Bible verse really quickly with a little bit of a silly picture just to wake you up after all that technical language. And then we'll go to some differences. All right. Everyone knows who that is? Right? Except for maybe our younger people. That's okay. This is Tevye from Fiddler on the Roof. He has a song called Tradition that's very silly and very fun. I think that musical is way sillier than most people do. I really enjoy it. It's kind of a serious musical about the pogroms but the strengths of the King James, and then I have the New King James in parentheses. We're not going to deal with the New King James a lot, even though I like it a great deal. The strengths of the King James. I say tradition, and that is not a bad thing, right? Luther's translation of the German Bible and Tyndale's translation and the authorized translation of the Bible in English, both of these documents, scholars will agree, basically created the modern German and the modern English language. If you read Shakespeare in the original language, right, it can be really hard to understand what he's saying. And he's living at this time when Shakespeare and the Bible together are changing the way English works. So if you ever had to try to read Chaucer's tales and been like, this is impossible, you have the King James and Shakespeare to thank for English looking the way it is now. So not only is the King James massively important in the Reformed tradition, it's just the single most important work in English history, period. It forms the basis of our language. Here are the translations in the King James that like every non-Christian knows. And look at how like beautiful these translations are, that have been unchanged for hundreds of years, right? Genesis 1:3, let there be light. Genesis 4:9, am I my brother's keeper? Numbers 6, the Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face to shine upon thee and be merciful to thee. The Lord lift his countenance upon thee and give you peace. John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Luke 2, there were shepherds abiding in the field. Matthew 5, blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Matthew 6:9, our Father who art in heaven. We say that in the King James every Sunday, don't we? Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Matthew 26, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. 1 Corinthians 13, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels. 2 Timothy, fight the good fight. Luke 22:62, one of the shortest whole verses in the Bible, it records that Jesus went out and wept bitterly. And John Piper has a good sermon on Tyndale. He talks about this, where every time someone plays with that verse, it is disaster. That is a beautiful, it's so powerful, right? He wept bitterly. There's a translation that says, Jesus went outside and cried really hard. It's not good, right? So, the King James is just a masterwork. It is gorgeous, it is beautiful, it created the modern English language. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. So that's great. It has a great value, every Christian should own a copy of the King James Bible, I think. It's just a gift. It's so pretty. So pretty. The Lord Shepherd. If you look at every translation of the Lord Shepherd, if you look at Psalm 22 and Psalm 24, you can find a lot of translation differences. You go to Psalm 23, no one will touch it because the King James is so beautiful, right? It's so ingrained in like our psyche that they don't even want to touch Psalm 23. The New King James is an update of the King James into modern English. I think it's a very strong translation. It's very popular. It was received very largely in the Reformed community. It was probably the most common Reformed Bible until the ESV was published. The New King James was really popular. It's a good translation. That the word that uses itself, I'm going to use all the words they use for themselves in a spirit of, believing what they're saying. It calls itself scrupulously faithful. And that idea of caring about scruples, of like what each thing is saying, more than even word choice, but what each thing is saying while being faithful to word choice is a good picture of the King James and the New King James. Now, there are problems. Clearly in the King James, the English has changed. And it's not these and thines and thous, right? Possessive language changed in between the 17th century and modern English, right? The use of pronouns can change. There's different whole pronouns they use. It's not just the small things. So I don't know, and I'm saying this humbly, I could be wrong, but I don't know how a modern American Christian can use the language of the King James to consistently understand the Bible in a way that a Koine Greek reader would have read the Koine Greek that Paul wrote in, right? The language of the people, things that you know, words that you know. That's, I think, the way you should read your Bible. So if you have a King James, all I would ask you to do is try to read another one as well, but it's perfect. Because of its, I think, honestly, somewhat limited source, right? There are times when the King James varies a little bit from the other translations we're going to read, right? It makes some choices based on the texts that were present to it that translate things differently. One of the really big examples of this is the book of Job, where Job 38 through 42, the King James uses descriptive language. Throughout the book of Job, the book of Daniel uses descriptive language that's uncommon in other translations. And so again, I think if you're only reading the King James, you're getting a very small window of what our text sources say. The New King James cleans this up a lot, but it's still kind of faithful to the choices that the King James made. So, King James, all these are essentially good translations. And what I'm trying to do is to go from, after this point, after the King James and the New King James, I'm trying to go from basically a word-to-word philosophy to a thought-for-thought philosophy. We're moving on the spectrum. So the first one up is the New American Standard Bible. This was one of the very first new translations, good new translations of the 20th century. So I had a friend who, in seminary, who every time he translated in class, it came out exactly like the New American Standard Bible. And we joked that under his seat, he was just going like this and then writing it down on his test because it was impossible. But if you read the New American Standard Bible, it kind of reads like this. I mean, it's very, very word for word, right? It looks like someone has every word they're doing. They have the Greek New Testament open and the English translation open, and they're just kind of going word for word. I will also say the guy looks a little bit confused, and sometimes the New American Standard Bible can be so direct that it can seem a little wooden, right? It can be a little confusing because it takes less time concerning itself with thought-for-thought, dynamic, poetic language. So it's very connected to the sources. There were great scholars who worked on it. It's very devoted to getting the words right. This word for itself is formal equivalence. It's word for word. It's a great gift in that. There's a reason why a lot of seminarians' Bible is the New American Standard Bible. And it's because they're learning Greek and Hebrew. And when you learn the Greek word and then translate in English, that's usually the word you find in the New American Standard Bible. So it's a wonderful translation for that reason, right? It's very faithful. It's very accurate. That being said, a lot of the Bible is written in poetic imagery. It's intentionally written in a way so that one word means multiple things at the same time. That's the essence of poetry and of prophecy. And so sometimes word-for-word translation can actually end up being less accurate when you're translating things like poetry and prophecy because you're needing to capture that dynamic meaning of words. And so I think that's a struggle. I call that missing the forest for the trees, right? It gets so focused on word choice that it's missing the picture that a biblical author is painting. And it can be a little wooden. So I will just say, I won't name my friend. You guys haven't met him. But on his final for Greek exegesis, we had to translate an entire chapter from the Gospel of Luke. And my professor, who has a very sharp sense of humor, said blank, his name, Johnny, this is so wooden you could build an entire fleet of boats. I guess that's why he's the NASB guy. So, NASB is a good translation. The next kind of is the English Standard Version. That picture's on there for two reasons. One, there's controversy around the ESV. We'll get to that. But two, and I say this with love in my heart for my current Fable Bible translation that I use all the time, the ESV kind of insists on itself, right? It kind of presents itself. It has this phrase it invented, essentially literal. And if you spend just 10 seconds thinking about those two words, you can't put those next to each other in English, right? If I said, hey, I'm going to give you, this contract says that you're going to get $1 million tomorrow. And you're like, really? Well, yeah, it's essentially literal. You would say, well, hold on. Am I getting $1 million or am I not? So it's just a weird phrase, essentially literal. We know what they're going for, right? So the ESV is going to try to follow after the NASB by being primarily word for word, but it's going to try to be a little bit more poetic. It's going to try to be a little bit more grand and sweeping in its translation. It's going to try a little bit harder to capture thought in poetry and things like that. It had an extremely impressive group of scholars translating it. In a lot of ways, the minds behind it are like a murderer's row. It's like the 27 Yankees. And so it has a lot going for it in terms of the work that was put in the ESV. It's extremely trustworthy in the work that was put behind it. I think it is, in my humble opinion, which is all it is, I do think it is the best combination of word-for-word faithfulness with readability. That being said, sometimes the ESV gets very awkward. The ESV, you'll find many sentences with like 15 commas in them, right? Because they want to have this thought, but they're stuck to word for word. Whereas other translations will like, well, we'll just use a new word to keep this thought. And the ESV says, no, we're word for word, and so you'll find comma, 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 comma. And so that was, when we would translate, Dr. Kerr would say, no commas, you're not the ESV, because you're just either trying to cram everything into a sentence. So sometimes, although I think the ESV is very beautiful, it can be awkward in your reading of it. If you run into an awkward verse in the ESV, you're not crazy. You're not bad at reading your Bible. Same thing if you read the King James or NASB, you're like, this is really dense. You're not a bad person. It is dense. Sometimes the ESV is awkward, right? We're building up to a point I won't spoil, but this is why we have a lot of Bible translations. The ESV is also kind of just decided to jump into controversy with 2 feet for reasons that are beyond me. The translation of Genesis 16 is totally defendable scholastically. No one's asked me to translate a Bible, and they shouldn't, but I wouldn't have translated it that way. But then, these Bible translations we're all going to read to, most of them are open to continually editing, right? As new work is done, especially if you're critical text and you're open to the new sources we're finding, someone finds a new piece of papyrus from even earlier, yeah, let's incorporate that. Maybe that's helpful. So a lot of these translations continue to change. That's actually not a bad thing. But then what the ESV translating committee did was they made a couple of controversial translation decisions, like Genesis 3:16, and then they said, and now we're never changing it. No one can ever talk about this ever. And you're like, why would you do that? Right? Just keep the translation. Now they actually backed off that. There was such a backlash. That's a really weird thing for scholars to say, is no more scholarly work on this. But nonetheless, this has happened before the ESV, so it has kind of courted controversy unnecessarily. But it's my translation. I love it very much. The people who hold the publishing rights, Crossway, are very good at printing Bibles. So I will just say, as an added benefit, you want a pink Bible, you want a purple Bible, you want a Bible this big to put on your pulpit that everyone refuses to use even though it hurts your feelings, you can buy it. So that's one of the benefits of the ESV, is that they have 1 million versions of it, right? This is the translation that the Reformation Study Bible is printed in, which is my favorite study Bible by Ligonier Ministries. So ESV is a wonderful translation, ton of resources that are behind it. All right, next one is the newest one, the Christian Standard Bible. This was originally published, I think you can still find it, in 2009 as the Holman Christian Standard Bible, because it was Holman Publishing that made it. And they made some choices that were controversial, so then there was an update in 2015, and it was renamed the Christian Standard Bible. If you go to your Barnes & Noble now, this is, I think, the second most common after the King James and the New King James family. It's either this or the NIV. ESV used to be everywhere, but now this has gotten a really big push. One of the main driving forces behind the Christian Study Bible was to try to remove, they didn't use this language, but they were trying to remove Christianese, right? So words like justification, sanctification, the really famous one that people were upset about was there's a Greek word hilasterion, which is the word for the mercy seat, right? The place where blood sacrifice was made. And when we see that in Hebrews, almost every Bible just calls that. This is the mercy seat. Now, that is basically asking you to go do the work. You need to find out what the mercy seat is. Google it, go back in your Bible, find it. But what is the mercy seat? So the Holman Christian Standard Bible and the Christian Standard Bible changed this one, although many of the ones are still there, just changed it to when they see the word hilasterion, they write, the place where sacrifice was offered. Right? They kind of explain it for you. So that was the goal. This is kind of one of the main reasons it exists, although we'll get into the other reasons. Was it's trying to, in a sense, be still very faithful, very word for word, kind of in the tradition of the ESV or the RSV, like it's trying to be conservative word for word, but it's wanting to remove what it sees as translation stumbling blocks. Their word for it is optimal equivalence. I like this phrase much better than essentially literal, although it is another one of these cheat phrases. Like, we have the optimal translation. It's like, well, I sure hope you think you do. You worked very hard on this. But their point with optimal equivalence is they want to be the exact middle in between essential equivalence, which is word for word, and dynamic equivalence, which is thought for thought. So the Christian Standard Bible positions itself as the middle between these two ideas. So I think it's a very readable Bible that doesn't make any kind of changes on the sake of modernity. I think there's lots to commend it. I do think I think that was a mistake. The Bible is supposed to be a formative language. It is supposed to change the people who read it, right? And so I think deciding to change these things and overly explain them, number one, that's not what's in the original text, right? Paul could have said the place where, well, he didn't write Hebrews, but that's another hot take. Whoever wrote Hebrews could have written the place where sacrifices are offered. So one, I think it's a little bit of a bridge too far, right? You can have a note in your Bible that explains it. And two, I don't actually think it makes the Bible more readable, right? One of the things the Bible does as you read it again and again is you begin to be transformed to its way of thinking. It begins to renew your mind like it promises to do, right? And so it's good for you to pick up on strange words like covenant, like mercy seat, like justification, right? These are good words that force us to change the way we think. So even though I respect this translation, it's very, very useful, it's very readable, I think that was just maybe not a great choice. The story behind its creation is an odd one. It was actually originally invented to be a new translation of the majority text. That's where it came from. Was people saying, well, I'm a majority text guy, a TR guy, we talked about in the past. I want a new translation that's not based on the King James. They liked the New King James, but they said the New King James is too wedded to the King James. So I want to use the same source, because that's my position on those arguments, but I just want to make a new version. So this scholar got his funding together, commissioned it, and then died. And then the people who took over right after said, about that, we don't want to do majority text, we're going to do critical text. And you're kind of like, well then, why are you doing this? So there's certainly nothing wrong with the new translation of the Bible. It's a good thing, right? But with that change, and with the existence of things like with the New King James already existing for majority text being faithful, with the ESV, NIV, and NASB existing as faithful critical text translations, the presence of the Christian Standard Bible is a little confusing, right? I'm not quite sure what it's accomplishing, but it's a perfectly good, very readable translation. All right, now we're moving more into the thought-for-thought version of it, the New International Version, which was the dominant version for many, many years, still is. It's very, very popular. Of all of my 70 professors at Reformed Theological Seminary, very conservative, very Reformed, the 1978, the original version of the NIV was overwhelmingly their favorite, which I think says something interesting, right? Because the idea was it is the most readable, right? It is the easiest to read in modern English. And I do think the 1978 translation is very, very good. And there's a 1984 translation, which doesn't change too much. There's a lot to commend it. It's really wonderful. There's a reason it was really popular and widely used. They really are the first one that kind of takes this thought-for-thought dynamic equivalency idea. That's part of the reason it's so readable. Now, this is a little pejorative, but if you can imagine the meaning behind the picture, it's because the steering committee of the New National Version seems very devoted to running after the times. They keep making changes and updates to make it more and more in step, I think, with modernity. And that's why I think most scholars will tell you that the newer the translations of the NIV get, the worse they get. Because they are constantly trying to appeal to a modern audience, right? This was one of the very first translations that offered a version, not all NIV, but the big push NIV version. This was the first one to stop using gendered language in reference to God, which is wrong. It's just wrong, right? The Holy Scriptures record God using masculine language. Christ is a man. And so the NIV steering committee was the first one to say, actually, we're going to use non-gendered language when it comes to God, which is a huge mistake. So I think they chase relevancy a little bit in the modern versions. I think that was even a little bit true in the original, but it's a very faithful translation. I think the other issue is what I would call theological passivity. The translating committee of the NIV also makes choices to basically avoid matters of theological controversy. And if translation is interpretation, then you can't. And you shouldn't try to. The Bible is a book of theology, first and foremost. Because what's theology? It's the study of God. That's what the Bible is here to do, to help us know God. And so because of that interpretation, I think there are times when the NIV, a lot of Reformed scholars think it suffers due to its passivity. The last translation we'll talk about, another one that I think gets a bad rap, although I don't have a super high opinion of, is the New Living Translation. Apparently that's the new image for like handicapped accessibility. Yeah, see, none of us know it. So this is kind of a picture of the relationship to the New Living Translation, is that there's a new picture for like handicapped. And the kind of question is, why? So the old one was just the wheelchair. That's still one you see a lot, right? And then there was another one which I loved, but it was a wheelchair guy going fast. Have you seen that one? Like he's bent over, like he's really booking. And I'm like, I think that's really sweet. I like that one. That's my favorite one. But the idea was that, well, that was still not incorporating handicapped people who aren't in wheelchairs. And you're like, you know what, guys? I think we're over-concerned this time. So I think that would be my understanding of the New Living Translation. I think it has a great desire to be readable. It is so readable. There are times where I absolutely use it in my study because the language of it, in the English that I speak right now, it's powerful to read things like that, right? And so I think that's a real gift that it's in common language. It's a thought for thought. And the NLT isn't going to say things in its original version, again, that harm doctrine. I do think it ends up at a point sometimes of linguistic compromise. The NLT is also one that published a gender-inclusive version, which is unnecessary. I actually think it's insulting, for example, specifically to women. The fact that women are called sons in the New Testament is one of the most pro-women things that exists because it's saying that women are inheritors, that they're the heir, like a son inherits his father's kingdom. That's how women are in the New Covenant language of God. That's an amazing statement. It's not ruling out women. It's radically incorporating for the first time. Changing that to fit modern language, I don't think is a good idea. And that's kind of some of the things the NLT swings and misses on. I also think there's some theological imprecision. My biggest takeaway in all this is, my greatest commendation for you is own multiple translations of the Bible. Own several of them. I would actually argue, if you have the means, and yes, you can buy them online, but I'm a book guy, get actual physical Bibles. Get a copy of each version. It can be so useful to read a couple different versions. In no small part, maybe the biggest thing is, you don't realize how much you're being shaped by the version you read. So whatever one of these ones you pick, and I would really say probably not the NLT as your single primary, but if it's the old NIV, any of those ones you pick, you're going to be shaped by that language. And reading other translations helps you realize, oh, these interpreters made a choice. It's helping you get a full picture of the Word of God. So we're basically done on time. If you want to go, I totally understand. I went long, but now we're just going to go do a couple cross-section verses. So we'll do that real quick. So I chose passages from the four major genres: narrative, poetry, prophecy, and didactic literature, which is like law and epistle. You should do this because of this. So this is Nehemiah 8:8. This is narrative. So I'll start with the King James. So they read in the book, in the law of God distinctly, and gave the sense and caused them to understand the reading. King James. This is now the New American Standard. They read from the book, from the law of God, translating to give the sense so that they understood the reading. NASB. Now you can see, again, none of these are going to change all that much. That feels a little wooden to me, but that's, maybe you're like, man, that's perfect. ESV. Look at all the commas. They read from the book, from the law of God clearly, and they gave the sense so that the people understood the reading. It's actually not my favorite translation out of these. You guys see all the commas though? There's like 7 of them. That's kind of how the ESV works sometimes. I really like the Christian Standard Bible one here. They read out of the book of the law of God, translating it and giving the meaning so that the people could understand what was read. Now in the Hebrew there, the word for translating means to translate or to explain. And so they made, I think, a clever choice to just use both of the definitions as they're translating. So then it's even easier to understand. NIV, they read from the book of the law of God, making it clear and giving the meaning so that the people understood what was being read. Similar kind of choice, right? The New Living Translation, they read from the book of the law of God and clearly explained the meaning of what was being read, helping the people understand the passage. So you see how the NLT is still clear, but now it's kind of introducing words here, and they're small ones, to give it a better flow. That's Nehemiah. If you have questions, go ahead and shout them out, but we'll keep going. Ecclesiastes, this was my favorite one. King James, which is the one that we all know. It's one of those King James verses. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. That's one of those powerful translations that stuck with us. Even though, here's what's interesting, the word vanity did not mean, in 17th century England, what it means now. Right? To us, now vanity is like taking selfies of yourself in a mirror. That was certainly included in their understanding of vanity, but if you remember Pilgrim's Progress, he goes to Vanity Fair, and Vanity Fair is fundamentally not a place of people who like looking at themselves in the mirror. It's an absurd place, right? It's a place of like extreme human inward focus. It's more than our version of vanity. So this is why Dr. Estelle at Westminster, California actually likes to translate absurdity of absurdities. So vanity of vanity though, the King James is so powerful that you'll see the ESV keeps that translation pretty much directly, right? Because it's such a powerful translation. The NASB, futility of futilities, says the preacher. Futility of futilities. The CSB chooses that word of well. Absolute futility, it now adds. So you see how it's getting rid of the repetition. Because repetition is a very common thing in Hebrew and Greek. It's less common in English, right? You might say, why are you repeating yourself? So their way of translating that into modern English is to take away the repetition, but to keep the emphasis that repetition implies. Absolute futility. Absolute futility. New International Version, meaningless, which might be maybe the closest word choice. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless, everything is meaningless. And now the New Living Translation, again, not really changing the fundamental point, but you see how much it differs now. Everything is meaningless, says the teacher, completely meaningless. So it's really kind of changing the sentence structure in a way. All right, I think next is prophecy. So we did this for the message. Again, you're going to hear the King James and hear the version you've heard. And then I said, woe is me, I am undone, because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. And that undone, right? We think of that when we think of this verse, but it's not a word we use very often in modern English. Then I said, woe to me, I am ruined, because I'm a man of unclean lips, NASB. ESV, woe to me, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips. Christian Standard Bible, woe is me. So you see how NASB, woe to me, again, that's a Hebrew directional, it's difficult. CSB, ESV, woe is me, for I am ruined, because I am a man of unclean lips and live among a people of unclean lips. And you're going to see too, it's going to, with the NASB and the Christian Standard Bible, are going to translate Lord of Hosts, which does have, a host is an army. And a lot of people don't know that when you read Lord of Hosts. What's a host? And you think, oh, he's the Lord of people who have people over for dinner. Right? He's the Lord of Hosts. No, a host is an army. It's what a bannerman would call. His host would come and support him. So army is a good translation. It's just that the King James, when it was written, they called armies hosts. And so the fact that the King James kept calling it Lord of Hosts and that filtrated into our language so severely that we've broadly kept that, even though we don't understand that word host very much anymore. NIV, woe to me, I cried, for I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips. And then New Living Translation, then I said, it's all over, for I am doomed, for I am a sinful man. I have filthy lips, and I live among a people of filthy lips, yet I have seen the King, the Lord of heaven's armies. Some people translate Lord of hosts, Lord of angel armies, and so that's what it's getting into play there. All right, last one. Didactics. King James, having predestined us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself. So I think you get the wooden older language there. That's not the way we would talk nowadays, right? Having predestined us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ to himself, according to the good pleasure of his will. NASB, I think, also has a wooden. He predestined us to adoption as sons and daughters. So, interestingly, the NASB here is the one that's choosing to add the multi-gendered language, which I wasn't expecting, right? The word there is, it has hui, which is son in it. So, that's the only word there in the Greek. ESV, he predestined us for adoption to himself as sons through Jesus Christ, according to the purpose of his will. I think that's the best translation here. It reads the most like modern English while preserving the connective tissue of the language, and they only have one comma in the whole thing. Christian Standard Bible, he predestined us to be adopted as sons through Jesus Christ for himself, according to the good pleasure of his will. NIV, he predestined us for adoption to sonship through Jesus Christ, in accordance with his pleasure and will. NLT, God decided in advance to adopt us into his own family by bringing us to himself through Jesus Christ. This is what he wanted to do, and it gave him great pleasure. So this is a place where the NLT isn't adding, it's adding a ton of words that aren't there, but it's not adding a new doctrine. And Paul wants you, when you read this verse, to think of what the NLT is saying, that it was his will, it was his desire, it was his joy, which is certainly true Zephaniah, other places. And so the NLT here, even though it is kind of adding, does a really good job driving home the emotion of what Paul is saying in Ephesians 2. And so although King James is correct, this is a rare situation where the King James doesn't really have the power of the statement, but the New Living Translation seems to have it a little bit more. And so I think that exercise really shows us why you want to grab a ton of different Bibles. Every time you read the Bible, you don't need to have 6 versions open for you. God will preserve his word and use it. But if you decided, hey, I'm going to really read the book of Romans this year, I'm going to read it like 4 or 5 times, it's really wonderful to grab a Bible, grab several Bibles, compare and contrast them. So with that, I'm going to pray. We went super long. If you have questions about Bible translations, I can point you to my favorite things you can buy. That's always fun, right? Encouraging people to spend money. I have a couple